The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is brought to you by 7 amazing individuals. Greg Ross, Bill Illuminati, Allison Cook, No One, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
All right, welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight, from literally halfway around the world, I am talking to Mr. Chris G. from New Zealand. Hello.
Hello.
You might be the first person I've had on from New Zealand. I've had a bunch of people from Australia. I don't think I've ever had anyone in New Zealand.
It's not that far away.
I know. I know.
Sort of vaguely similar place.
Is it? What's it like where you live?
It's nice. It's like a quieter version of Australia. It's funny. I used to travel quite a bit, and people used to ask things like, "Is it true you can walk from Australia to New Zealand when the tide goes out?" and things. But
I never thought that would be a thing. I'm assuming that's not true.
No, it's very much not true. It's a lot like Canada here, just a lot smaller and less funny accents, or more funny accents.
It seems like a nice place, and everything I've heard about it and all the pictures and stuff I've seen about it, it just looks like a beautiful place.
Yeah, no, it is a nice place.
Australia seems scary in spots, mostly because of the animals.
I don't know. I've got a real soft spot. I spent a lot of time in Sydney, and I really like it there. At some of the places in New Zealand, it's sort of the worst case of the worst bits of small towns and the worst bits of big cities.
Oh,
kind of in this horrible Venn diagram of the worst of both, without the benefits of either. But,
oh, beautiful. Yeah, well, that happens everywhere, unfortunately. That's a people thing.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And I think any place you live, if you live there long enough, the more you get to know the people, the higher the chance of finding people who in some way diminish the experience for you.
Right.
But I think in general, most places are nice.
Yeah, I would agree.
If you go about it the right way.
So you've had 2 major experiences, but a few little ones as well. And you did the right thing. You wrote me and then wrote me again because I didn't respond to you, because I totally saw your message, went, I need to write this guy back, and then didn't.
Well, I worried a bit about that, because you always feel like you don't want to hassle people. The natural assumption is if people don't get back to you, they don't want to hear from you. But
right.
You did mention in one of your podcasts too, people should chase you if they haven't heard for a while. So
absolutely, because what happens is either A, I thought I responded and I didn't, or B, I read it, I didn't have time to respond, and then I completely forgot about it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
So it's an overwhelming amount of stuff to keep track of, and I understand the not wanting to bug people too, because that's how I feel. But when I message someone about coming on the show and they don't get back to me, I'm like, do I message them again, or are they not interested? You know,
there's that famous saying. It gets attributed to all sorts of people, but most commonly, I think Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's when you worry what other people think of you, you'd be reassured to know just how infrequently they do.
That's nice. I like that.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that's really alarming how often it's relevant or accurate.
Yeah.
Quite often you'll see people who are stressing out about, this person hasn't replied, what if this or that, or that person was a bit funny, what if this or that, and you just think maybe they're just in their own head and it's not about you. But
oh yeah, certainly. I like you though. I don't want to bug somebody. I don't want to There was a musician recently who was playing in town close by, and I had interviewed him before, and I messaged him. I said, hey, do you want to do another interview at your show? Because it's been a couple of years. And he read it and didn't respond. And I was like, okay. And so I waited till I got to the show, and I messaged him. I'm like, I'm here if you want to do an interview. And he gets back to me immediately. He's like, oh, my God, I'm sorry. I thought I wrote back. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think for most people, I don't know. These days it seems increasingly the other way, but I think generally if people don't want to hear from you, they'll tell you.
True.
Or block you.
Yeah. That's a good point.
It's musicians, especially. Like I have had the privilege of meeting a few of my sort of favorite, musicians I respect or whatever. And it's funny because in those situations, I tend to just be like, this person is just a person. They'll have annoying people bothering them all the time. And if you treat them as a human, they're really cool and they will really enjoy your company and they'll be really relieved that you're being chill. And then you'll have some weird fan being weird and it ends up turning into this joke where you're like, what the hell is wrong with that person?
Yeah.
Which is great because then you have this special moment. There was one, I was backstage at a concert. It was a well-known band. I'm not going to say who it was, but there was this crazy super fan and they were being really weird. But what was really strange is the front person was really enjoying all the attention. So I ended up just standing with the rest of the band kind of going like, is he always like this? And they were like, you have absolutely no idea. It's really refreshing that. So we're all just sort of hanging out, making fun of the front person on the side while they tried to sleaze on this person. It was really...
Yeah, I generally find if you treat them just like people really appreciate that, where you're not, like I never ask for autographs. I rarely ask for pictures with the band, but usually I'm trying to do a little better about that just because it's a cool thing to have. But like, I don't care about autographing things or anything like that. It's like, whatever, like I'm just happy to talk to people.
Well, yeah. And again, when I've had the privilege of meeting a few of the people, not just musicians, but mainly musicians. And if you're kind of chill and laid back, what happens is everyone else clears out and then they want to sit and talk.
Yeah.
And inevitably they'll offer you a selfie like, oh, we should take a photo because it's the go-to. It's like, well, obviously you're going to want a photo with me to remember this. And
right.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's get to your spooky experiences. The first one relates to your grandmother.
Yeah, it does. What's weird, I was just thinking while we're talking, I am fascinated by mysteries. I'm fascinated by the paranormal. I've never really come across anything that's felt, I've been really disappointed by looking into stuff and being like, this clearly doesn't pan out. Yeah. If I were to find one common thing between everything I've experienced that weirds me out in some way, it's that there's this common theme of sort of time and it being fluid in some way.
Yeah.
And I could explain everything that's weird to me. Like there was this place in town here where I live that always, from as long as I can remember, it filled me this weird sense of dread every time I was near it. And there was no reason. It was just an ordinary spot. There was no reason. But then a couple of years back, I had a really, really unpleasant experience that really traumatized me there. And it was one of those events that happened. And it was right in that spot. And I remember thinking when it happened, like, oh, it all makes sense now. I now understand why for my entire life, this particular spot has filled me with dread. It was almost like some sort of weird pre-echo of knowing that at some point something really upsetting was going to happen to me there.
Yeah, retrocausality, definitely. But
then, so if I could draw that straight line through it all, this is where you start to overthink things and you start going down rabbit holes because, I know you have said on a number of occasions, it is possible that we create or manifest what we experience because it's in some way our expectation or whatever. So then you start to think, if I have this thing in my head that there is this fluid time component to seeing back or forwards through time, and that is a common element, do things start, is that just the go-to explanation of how you try to make sense of it? Or is it happening to you because that is your expectation or your view? But it's just an interesting thought that the common line through everything that has come close to being strange for me is in some way most explicable by a kind of permeable time sort of situation.
And I see that a lot in experiences. I mean, I did a whole show on the idea of there being a mechanism behind, like what happened in Point Pleasant, that has to do with retrocausality and things moving backwards, and then people picking up that information, that tragic event from years in the future, and then basically creating poltergeist manifestations or presenting energy that other stuff could utilize to manifest, which is why everything stopped when the bridge collapsed.
Yeah, right. So. Yeah, so in that sense, it was inevitable.
Right. And that's the thing. Like, do we have free will? I don't know. I'd like to believe we do. I mean, clearly we don't know if we don't. So it feels like free will.
I had this weird experience when I was little. Sorry, I know you asked me a straight up question.
No, that's okay.
About my grandma, right. But when I was really, really little, like 5 or 6 years old, I used to really enjoy McDonald's thick shakes. Mm-hmm. And one day my sister explained to me, do you understand what those are made of? They're like ground up hooves and eyeballs and whatever, she told me. And it didn't bother me at the time. And then she got really annoyed that it didn't throw me. And she said, knowing what I just told you, why do you still enjoy them? And I said, it doesn't change my experience of it. Like knowing what it is that goes into what makes it doesn't change how I have always experienced it.
Yeah.
Therefore, and it's, similar concept, right? Like if you have no free will, it doesn't change your experience of life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You're not capable of stepping outside of that and experiencing life with free will. Therefore, it becomes an irrelevant constraint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's playing a video game that has a linear path, It doesn't reduce your enjoyment of the game knowing that the path is already laid out because you haven't experienced it.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, back to your grandmother.
So, sorry. So, if it's okay, I will give you some context because
Sure.
I feel like the context is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was very, very young, my parents divorced when I was quite young, and my dad disappeared off overseas, and then I would spend some time with his parents, who I think felt it was important for me to sort of spend time with his side of the family a bit. So I'd go spend a few days at a time staying with my grandparents on his side, and they had a very, very nice house. It's quite a wealthy family on my dad's side, and we would spend time walking around that property. And there was this particular spot in the garden, and I was very, very, very young, like I must have been 4 or 5 years old, and I was walking around the garden with my grandmother, and we sat down, and I told her how much I enjoyed the property, and it was a really nice garden, and there was a little river running through it and things, and we were sitting beside it looking at the river, and I said, look, I really like this property, just because that was what I was thinking in the moment. And I will never forget the conversation, because it was the first time, when you're a little kid, if someone treats you like you're not a kid, it really makes an impression.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And it was the first time I'd ever had that sensation of sort of not being treated like a little kid. And she said to me with this like really weird, serious air, I love this property too, and I want you to make me a promise. And I distinctly remember she said, do you know what a promise is? And I said, yeah, I understand the concept of a promise. And she said, I want you to promise me that you'll never let anything happen to this property. And I didn't understand at the time what that could mean, but I just said, yeah, of course. And I was really pleased to be given the sort of, it felt like a real sense of responsibility. Oh, I'm going to be the policeman of this property. So I agreed, and then we continued our walk. But she had really stressed, like, this is really important to me. I love this property. It's really important to me. You really need to promise me nothing will ever happen to it, even when I'm gone. So I agreed to all of that, and then I didn't think about it for years and years and years and years. And then she and my granddad both ended up too old and too unwell with different health issues to stay there, and they moved to hospice care.
Yeah.
So I ended up being the guardian of the property, and that I would have the key, and I'd go check on the, couple of times a week. I'd go make sure everything was okay, and I'd walk around the house, and also if any of so my dad had a couple of brothers and a sister, and they were all no longer in town. And if any of them were back in town, I would sort of meet them at the airport and take them there, and I would let them into the property, and I was sort of the caretaker in a way. And she she became very unwell with cancer, and she was a very stoic, and she was from a time when to be seen suffering the indignities of a terminal illness in the late stages was a bit more than she felt comfortable with, except for those most close to her. So as things got towards the end, the grandchildren, like myself, sort of out of respecting her wishes, stayed away from her and allowed just her sons and daughter to visit her. It was right at the very, very end, and because it was the very end, the whole family had sort of flown back into town, and they were all staying at that house. So I was there with my cousin, and my dad and my auntie were at the bedside of my grandmother. And my cousin and I were playing card games to entertain ourselves, and it was getting quite late. We put on a cup of tea, and then we kept playing cards. And I had this really, really, really strange sense of feeling. Have you ever had that? You know, that really sort of feverish, like fever dream feeling?
Yes.
And everything feels really distressing and sort of feverish, and you'll be in that weird liminal state somewhere between awake and asleep, and it all just feels really distressing and upsetting. So I started feeling like that really weirdly, like really, really distressed, and there was this really strong smell component to it. And I was getting really distressed, and in the end I said to my cousin, I feel really weird, and there's some horrible smell. Do you smell that smell, or am I having some sort of weird brain aneurysm or something?
Right.
And she said, no, I can definitely smell a weird smell. And we sort of shrugged it off, and we were sort of thinking about it. And then we realized we'd put the kettle on, and the kettle was one of those super old school kettles that doesn't turn itself off. So we'd put it on, and the water had boiled, and instead of just turning off, it had boiled dry. And what we were smelling was the element, this really strong kind of carbon smell of the element overheating.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good smell.
No, well, it certainly, I mean, it was a relief to understand what the smell was.
Sure.
But we ran through, and the kettle had been sitting on a breadboard or a chopping board, and that was really badly singed. And the curtains behind the bench, were smoking, like they were actually smoldering, because this overheating kettle was throwing off so much heat. So we took the kettle outside, we pulled the curtains off the curtain rail, and we took it all outside. We doused it with water, and we left it outside. We cleaned up, and there was quite a thick smell of smoke in the room. The house because the house had been unoccupied largely, there'd been a security system, and it had a smoke detector as part of it, and it would notify the security company if anyone tried to break in or if there was smoke detected or whatever. So I had these nightmares of, I was a teenager at the time, and of course what you don't want is to be the person who's responsible for some sort of drama. That indignity was too much to bear. So I called the security company straight off and said, look, we've had a bit of an incident here. It smelled a bit smoky. I don't know if it set the alarms off, but what I don't want is for some silent alarm to cause fire trucks to show up and things.
Yeah.
So I said, I'm just calling to say it's all under control. And they said, cool, totally fine. Hadn't detected anything, but we'll put it in the log that you've called and that you've had an incident and everything's okay. So my cousin and I went back to playing games. Would have been about an hour and a half later. My dad came home with my auntie. And first thing he did when he came through the front door was he stuck his head into the room and he said, "Did you get the kettle?" in this really ridiculous over-the-top voice. At which point, of course, I'm pissed off because I'd very clearly discussed with the security company that what I did not want was for anyone to find out that we'd had a close call. So here I am just assuming that the security company has had a conversation with us, hung the phone up, and immediately phoned my dad or my auntie or something and dobbed us in. I distinctly remember my auntie was sort of chastising him, like, "Oh, don't," which I took at the time as being, "Don't tease them.
Yeah,
they got it under control. Don't beat up on them." So I said, "Look, we got it under control pretty quickly. We put the kettle outside. Everything's fine. I called the company and I told them not to bother you with it." So then he and my auntie sort of stand there and stare at us like, "What the hell are you talking about?" So I go back through it. I say, well, we put the kettle on. We realized we left it on. We forgot that it doesn't turn itself off. We smelt the funny smell. We realized the kettle had boiled dry. We ran in. We got there in time. No harm was done. Everything's fine. We called the company as a precaution, and everything's under control. My dad and my auntie were very much sort of confused by all this, which started really annoying me, because I'm like, if you walk in the door and the first thing you want to do is give me grief about the situation, can you please just cut to the chase and stop being annoying about it? At which point they explained the security company had not called them, and what in fact had happened was that my grandmother had descended into a weird feverish state and had said only three things. The first of which was when she snapped out of it, sat bolt upright and started ranting about the kettle. Someone tell him about the kettle, tell him to get the kettle. And then she'd been really distressing everybody by what, to their mind, was an incredibly, like, put yourself in the situation where somebody sits up and starts saying something like that. You think they are completely off the deep end.
Sure, yeah.
Like that would be a distressing thing to see with no context. That continued for a bit. They hit the call button for a doctor. The doctor arrived. The doctor was unable to sort of really help. And they were all fussing over her, and eventually she said, oh, he's got it, good, and lay back down.
Wow.
So this is where the context of the fact that she said tell him to get the kettle especially speaks to me, because in theory I'm the one that made the promise to her that I wouldn't let anything happen to the house.
Right.
I was also struck by, I smelt the smell, but what I can't explain and what my cousin didn't experience is that weird nightmarish fever state, like that weird fever dream feeling. And I can't help but feel like there's some connection between the fact that she was in a feverish state by being in the final stages of dying of cancer and also with a whole load of narcotics on board.
Yeah.
Like there's got to be some sort of link between the way I felt and the fact. So yeah, that was where it started. But then, of course, the next question is, what were the other two things she said? Yeah. By the time we'd figured all of this stuff out, it was pretty late. We all agreed we were going to call it a night. She passed away, and so the next day was pretty busy with that. And then the morning after that, we were sitting around the breakfast table and the phone rang, and my auntie dealt with it because she was a little bit better at that stuff than my dad was. So she went and had this phone call. Then she walked in and she said she looked absolutely ashen. Like she looked, if anyone ever says you look like you've seen a ghost, I think of how my auntie looked in that moment. But she came in and she proceeded to explain that, so the next door neighbors, when my dad and his brothers and sister had been growing up, they'd been very good friends with the neighbor over the fence who had a child the same age as them, and they'd all become very firm friends, and they'd stayed firm friends their whole life. She walked in and she said that neighbor had died during the night, had been driving back from, they had a holiday home. I live in the South Island of New Zealand. Up at the northern end between the two islands, there's an area that's quite popular for people to have holiday homes. They had a holiday home there, and as they'd been driving back, it was late at night. It was a stormy night. They had received a puncture. They'd pulled off to the side of the road, and he had been changing the tyre. And as he changed the tyre in the rain, he wasn't far enough off to the side, and someone came around the corner, and with the bad visibility, they had hit him and killed him. My auntie delivered the news, and my dad and my auntie sort of looked at each other, and my dad said, smashed like an egg. At which point my auntie said, I don't want you to talk about this, got really upset, and basically left the house. Obviously, I want to know what's going on. Yeah. Because I'm a teenager and I'm watching some sort of weird thing play out with a whole bunch of subtext. So what's going on? My dad informs me that the second of three things that my grandmother had said that last night they had been with her was that after the whole kettle thing, she had sat up and said, I can't remember if his name was Jimmy or Timmy. And the reason I can't remember is because I was briefly seeing someone whose very young daughter loved the story so much, she used to get me to tell it to all of her friends on slumber parties. But she also always used to use a different name each time. And I've now got to the point I can't remember the correct name of the neighbor. But it was either Jimmy or Timmy.
All right.
she had sat straight up, and let's say it's Jimmy. She had sat up and said, "Somebody turn Jimmy, somebody get Jimmy." And then she'd been really aggravated, and then all of a sudden she said, "Too late! He's smashed all over the road like an egg."
Oh wow!
And immediately passed out again. Now that was a couple of nights before this,
right?
So obviously, my next question is, well, what was the third thing she said? And my dad said, "I will never tell you." Which drives me insane.
Yeah, no kidding.
He never has. I asked him, I don't see him much. We are not on the best of terms. But I did ask him a couple of years back, and he swore black and blue he doesn't remember. I do not believe it. He's the kind of guy who just doesn't like to talk about stuff. Yeah. So, it's the first two were right on the money.
Yeah. It also makes me think of Fatima, where they were given 3 predictions, and the last one was never released publicly.
Well, this is the annoying thing, right? Like, why does it have to be such a good story?
Yeah, I know. Huh. Yeah, that's, and I mean, the one seems like it was happening concurrent with your situation, like she was connected to you.
Well, that's exactly an infuriating thing. It's like, I'm a computer guy, and I think if something happens at the time, and then the next one's a little bit forward in the future, how far forward in the future was the third thing?
Yeah.
Or was it? I don't know, but yeah.
Clearly, whatever it was, your dad didn't like it.
Yeah, which bothers me more than if he'd just tell me whatever it is, right? Like, there's something inexpressibly disconcerting about the way he was like, I'm never going to talk about. I'm totally cool telling you about the first two, but I don't want to even talk about the third one.
Yeah.
If I know him the way I think I know him, I suspect it is something to do with him, or I think it was anything else he would tell me.
Oh, okay. Huh.
Or it could have been about me. I don't know, but if you worry what others think of you and all that. So, but it does raise it's like I said, it does raise that specter of, is time permeable in some way?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is time happening all at once, and we're just experiencing it in order, except for those moments when we're not.
Yeah, which would be the perfect explanation for a lot of stuff, because, if you're not equipped to understand the non-linearity of time, all those weird experiences you have, that would be why they feel so strange, and why there's that weird otherworldly feeling about it all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was someone I had on, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head. I believe he was from British Columbia. And if I remember right, he does really cool woodworking stuff with driftwood. And his name is I'm completely blanking on his name now, but he was one of my favorite guests to have on the show, because he had what he initially interpreted as a Bigfoot encounter. But as he went through the experience, more and more, it seemed like he was having time slips.
Oh, right.
And it was like, this is really fascinating, because even the one sort of UFO experience he had also seemed to be a time slip. It was something he experienced, like he was in a building, and then later in his life, he went into that same building and was like, wait a minute, this is the building from what I saw in my abduction type of thing. And yeah, I mean, so much of it seemed to just be like time reverberating almost.
Yeah, like preverb.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
It's tantalizing as well, right? Because it's one of the few explanations that can explain a lot of things, that also it's not a huge leap physics-wise.
Right.
All it takes is accepting that if time is a dimension, the fourth dimension, which it's not, but
right.
If it's the seventh dimension or whatever, if it's a dimension, in theory, it's possible to move freely across that dimension.
Right.
In which case, just the fact that we're only attuned to experience it in one dimension, it's like was it Aristotle who had the example of, that really hackneyed story of, if you were a prisoner in a cave and all you'd ever seen is the shadow of people against the wall projected,
I think that
you're not equipped to understand the third dimension.
I think it was Plato. I think it's Plato's cave. Yeah.
Plato would make more sense. But, it's the sort of thing it's a much easier to accept explanation for stuff, is that time is a dimension, and just because we're not equipped to traverse at will backwards and forwards through it, doesn't mean it's not possible, and that strange experiences are a byproduct of us experiencing it non-linearly.
Right.
Like, that makes it quite a tempting explanation for things.
It's, we're all time traveling. We're just doing it in a very linear
at a
fashion.
rate of 1 second per second into the future.
And even that might change a little. I mean, because, it seems like sometimes stuff happens quicker than it should.
Yeah, or slower, depending on how much you've drunk. But
also true. I'm looking for that guy's name, too. Alex Whitcombe.
Okay.
Alex Whitcombe, if you look him up on the show, his stories are pretty fascinating. And like I said, as far as I can tell, all of them could be explained by time slips, which was just fascinating to me because I was just starting to think that way when he came on and told his stories, and his stories are fascinating.
So what's your opinion in general of time slips?
Well, I think, I don't know. It definitely has a lot to do with the stuff we experience. Like I said, I'm not sure if we have free will or not. It certainly feels like we do. It may be that there are certain points in time that, like, maybe before we come here, we want to have these experiences. How we get to them may vary. How many of them we get to may vary. But I think that time doesn't exist outside of here.
Yeah.
So you get near-death experiencers who, will say they were in a timeless realm. And they can't really explain what it's like because you can't experience that here.
Well, it's like trying to explain Coca-Cola to someone that's never tried a cola, right?
Right. You can, under certain circumstances with meditation, have that sense of oneness with the universe. And that also can be a timeless sensation, but you can't sort of retain that in normal functioning in this reality. Like that's a moment outside of time. So it seems like this is the way we experience things. It's the way our brains are equipped to process things. In the Seth material, Seth talks about like the reason time seems to move at different speeds is because like the more you're doing, the more like your brain is doing, the faster time moves, which makes sense because if you're busy or you're having fun or whatever, your brain is very engaged and time seems to fly. When you're not doing anything and you're just like sitting and waiting, time seems to just stall.
Yeah, which isn't that dissimilar to like the main loop of a game or whatever. Like if you're writing code, you have something that updates, it gives the illusion of continuous activity by doing the same thing over and over. And you'll get, anyone that's played a game will experience that sense of it'll lag out for a few frames. The frame rate will die for a couple of frames if it's doing lots of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you really can compare our existence to a video game. I'm not saying that's what it is, but there's...
I'm sorry to cut you off. It's crazy having written, dabbled in some AI code and stuff. The way emergent behaviors you'd never expected just emerge out of a couple of very simple rules for things. Like it really, really, it's startling and it changes your perspective on a lot of stuff. When you see something you've written behave more intelligently than you expected it to.
I haven't read it in a long time, but there's a book by Michael Talbot called The Holographic Universe. And in it, he talks about an experiment they did with like little robots. They were very simple. They sound almost like what we now use for like vacuuming, the little Roombas.
Yeah.
And he said they all started developing their own sort of personality. Some of them would be more shy. They'd kind of go hide when people came into the room. But this was not stuff that was programmed into them. Like their commands were kind of randomized, but they seem to actually show some sense of consciousness after a while, even with just randomized responses.
Well, it's that thing, right? Like if you get any sufficiently connected network of things, it at some point attains sentience.
Yeah.
And if you have neural networks and stuff, they exhibit intelligence. And the more complicated the network, the higher the perceived level of intelligence from our perspective. And it makes you wonder about if you connected enough computers on the internet, would the internet become sentient? But also trees. You think of, people joke about the wood wide web of how trees can communicate. There's the mycelium paths underground and things of the fungi that link trees so they can communicate in some rudimentary sense. If you had a big enough forest that was connected like that, would it become sentient?
I think so. And I think trees on themselves have some level of sentience. It's just not something we understand. Because again, we're set to understand things from our perspective. We can't understand the perspective of a tree, how a tree experiences reality. I mean, because plants, they've shown plants will exhibit what seem to be fear. Like, so if they come in and they kill one of the plants, and then they come back in the next day with the same clippers, the plant's stress levels go up.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. But like, could there be like a meta consciousness that is a higher order consequence of these lesser intelligences all being connected and networked in some way?
I think so. I think consciousness is it's abundant. It's just, again, we don't necessarily recognize it.
Yeah. Well, I guess you'd have to be, by definition, at the level of that consciousness to recognize it.
That's why there could be life on other planets in the solar system. But if we don't, I mean, we're looking for carbon-based life that exists like how we know life exists. So if there's something that is not carbon-based in the gases of Jupiter that's alive, we're not going to find that because we don't even know how to look for that.
Yeah, or even other stuff in the same column of the periodic table. Like there could be silicon-based life on Earth.
Right. And I mean, there's, one of the ideas that explains some of this paranormal stuff is the idea of plasma intelligence.
Cool.
Yeah.
I like that.
I mean, that it fits a lot of UFO stuff. Plasma is definitely a part of that. So if you have intelligent plasma that periodically can interact with us, that's fascinating, but it's not going to speak our language. It's going to have to find another way to communicate with us.
You've made me think of a whole bunch of stuff, one of which is, did you ever hear that David Mitchell piece on necrophiliacs?
No.
Apologies. He makes a really interesting point, which is, he's like, I don't understand why it's a taboo, because all the other taboos, want to be clear, I'm not advocating necrophilia. I'm just
right. Reporting
a bit that I saw David Mitchell say, which I enjoyed because it was confronting. But he suggests the possibility of, he's like, it wouldn't bother me if on your driver's license there was another box you could tick. Like, do you want to, what's the way he puts it? He's like, no, I don't mind you harvesting my organs, and no, I don't mind some pervert having a go on me when I'm dead. And he makes the point. He's like, the thing that's scary about that is the prospect of waking up while it's happening. But he's like, I can't say for certain whether it would be more upsetting for me or for the necrophiliac.
Fair.
But it's the same with intelligences, right? Like if there is something that is an intelligence we're not capable of appreciating, would it perceive us as an intelligence?
Yes, also true. And you mentioned, harvesting organs. You get people who pick up information from organ donors. They'll get a heart or something, and suddenly they take on interests or characteristics of the person that donated the heart, which doesn't make any sense in the idea, the materialistic idea that all we are is our brain. Where does that information come from? Except it's all part of the whole.
What was that story? There was a guy, I can't remember the organ that was transplanted, but he inexplicably started hanging out at this particular coffee shop. And then he found out years later that was the favorite coffee shop of the person whose organ he had received.
Yep. And there's been people who suddenly develop interest in like classical music, and they find out the organ that was donated was a classical musician.
There's got to be an organ joke in there somewhere, but...
Yes, I hadn't really thought about that.
Speaking of the precog thing and the do we have free will, I meant to say back at the time, did you ever see that experiment where they had fighter pilots and they'd put them in simulators and they found they were responding, they'd throw curveballs at them in the simulator, and they had them hooked up to ECGs and stuff.
Yeah.
And they discovered that they were responding to curveballs before they had been thrown at them.
Yeah.
So they would have an adrenaline spike and a reaction response begin, and then fractions of a second afterwards, the controller of the experiment would then initiate the event.
Mm-hmm. This is very much like Dr. Bem's research in Cornell, where he was showing randomized images and with people with EKG monitors on, and the images that people react strongest to are either sexual or violent. That's where you see a spike in the brain activity. And the people would have that spike in brain activity just prior to the machine picking the image.
Yeah, right. So same thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's the same basic idea. And you also have there was another experiment done that showed that we actually make decisions before we're conscious of them.
I know that, but that makes sense to me that would be a different thing.
Right.
Have you ever seen Fleabag?
I don't think so.
We need to not get me started on Fleabag because I'm obsessed with it.
What is it?
It started off as a one-woman show by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. It was the first thing she ever did. And it got turned into a short TV series.
Okay, I think I've heard of it.
Years and years and years later, it got picked up for a second. Honestly, it's one of the most exquisitely written things I've ever seen. And in the second season, there's a scene where she's seen a therapist, and she ends up having this basically an argument with the therapist. And the therapist says, "You already know what you're going to do. You're just here to talk about it." So the main character says, "Well, so what's the purpose of coming to you then?" And the therapist just doubles down and says, "Well, look, I guess to feel better that you already know what you're going to do." And then, obviously a few episodes later, the character does follow through on this thing she's struggling with. But it struck me at the time as this amazing insight into human nature that people do. They make up their mind and then they'll agonize sometimes for seconds, but sometimes for days or weeks or months before they just do the thing they've already decided they're going to do.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel like I know myself pretty well on the things I'm going to do and not going to do. So, like I'll go to my doctor and she'll be like, "Well, you should do this." And I'll be like, "You're right, but I'm not going to." And she'll look at me and I'll be like, "Look, I know me. Like if I say I'm going to do it, I'm not going to do it. Like it's just not something I'm going to do. So I might as well just be upfront and tell you I'm not going to do that."
Some would argue that's more noble. It's like I could just navigate this social interaction.
Yeah.
Inauthentically, or I could tell you the truth.
Right. And I mean, she laughed. It wasn't something super serious. Anyway, it was just kind of a suggestion. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. But I think that it's funny. It's funny. Sometimes you see people, especially people you know well, you can tell they've made their mind up on something. And it's almost amusing to watch them struggle with coming to acceptance of, you watch them for a few days and then they do the thing and you're like, no kidding, you're going to do that.
Well, I've had two types of people come to me for advice. The people who really don't know what to do and they want options, and the people who have already decided what they want
and they want permission.
Yeah, exactly. They want you to say, "Yep, go ahead and do that." And it's like, all right, why am I here? I don't need to be here.
Well, I've always used that as the razor, right, for telling if someone you're close with or not. If someone comes to you for advice and you tell them what you know they want to hear, you are not close with them.
Okay.
If someone comes to you for advice and you tell them the correct answer, even if you know it's not what they want to hear, then you are close with them.
I like that. I generally don't. I generally just tell people what I think, honestly. I have a friend who every time he calls me, so the first thing he says is, "How are you doing?" And I answer him honestly. He's like, "Damn it, would you just say fine so I could tell you what I called you about?" I struggle with that a lot.
I am what I now understand as being slightly spectrumy. And I struggled for years in my early adolescence with people would say, "How are you?" And I would tell them how I was.
Right.
And it would be awkward and I wouldn't understand why.
Yep. People just want you to say fine. It's just small talk, and I don't do small talk.
Yeah. How's the weather? I faked a conversation once about sports. I was really proud of it. I thought I was going to fail. Rugby's really huge in New Zealand, and I just have no interest in rugby. Mm-hmm. I do enjoy a lot of sport, but rugby is not. But it's this near religious fervor here.
Yeah.
And I was in a social situation where it was very important that I not offend people. It was a business situation, and I was very tired, and I was not fully up. I wasn't fully booted up yet. I wasn't running person software.
Right.
And the people were like, "Did you see the game in the weekend?" And I knew that I could not just say I have absolutely no interest in rugby. So it was clear to me I had to fake it. So I was trying really genuinely. I just said, and I was desperately searching for something I could say in the moment that was true, that wouldn't give away that I hadn't seen So what I ended up saying, to my eternal embarrassment, was I especially enjoyed the bit where that team did the thing that changed its score.
How did they respond?
Well, as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, what have I done? I've totally failed. I've failed at peopling. And there was this really awkward silence for what felt like an eternity, but I'm sure was only sort of 5 or 6 seconds. And then one of the other people went, "Mate, I know exactly what you're talking about." And I thought, mate, I've done it.
That's beautiful.
This is easier than I thought.
Just be very, very, very non-specific.
Well,
let them fill it in.
I'm fairly certain that was more about the other person carrying the weight for me. There's an XKCD cartoon I loved that was 2 sports commentators sitting in a box, and it was captioned "Every sports commentary ever." And one of the sports commentators is saying, "Let's use this weighted random number generator to construct a narrative," which is every sports commentary ever.
I suppose it is.
Yeah. By the way, just before I forget it, I used to be obsessed with David Paulides and his stuff.
Oh, okay. The missing 411 stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And at the risk of getting your show cancelled through internet backlash, I used to be a big fan. And then one of his cases was 10 kilometers from my house.
Oh.
And he misreported a lot of the details.
Yeah. So when he started out, as far as I can tell, he was pretty genuine. He didn't have access. Like, we found more reports in newspapers since then that show that the cases weren't mysterious. Some of them were still weird, but a lot of them were explained. But also, he probably didn't have the access that we have today. But
I appreciate it. I think it was you, actually, that made the comment that at the time he didn't have access to the sort of information we have now. And at the time of writing, a lot of it would have been authentic to what was known.
Right. And I think that was either Russ or Kyle of the Snake Brothers who made that comment, because I was going through this stuff going, well, there's all these other articles, and they're like, those papers probably weren't digitized in 2011 when he was writing about this stuff, or 2012, whatever it was. But later cases, including the one on the documentary he did, he misreported stuff. He left stuff out. People were writing me going, this case isn't what he's making it out to be. And I'm going, all right, like.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is, that's what threw me, because I appreciate that point and I agree with it, because you can only, despite my earlier assertions, time is not permeable and you can't see through see into the future to know how it's. But there were fundamental aspects of the one here that even in his first writing just directly contradicted what was known. And it felt very much like he was trying to force it into a cookie cutter. And I'm sure I thought about it, and I think it's one of those cases where sometimes if people are absolutely certain they're right, they'll become less stringent in, they'll fudge things slightly because they're like, well, I'm right anyway. What does it matter if I fudge this detail?
Right. And that's also what happened. What happened with people like Bud Hopkins. He was so convinced that he had the UFO abduction thing figured out that he was fudging details to make the cases look better. Not because he was trying to be dishonest, but because
he was trying to sell his argument.
Yeah. So what was the case near you?
There was a woman that went, I think her name was Emma Campbell. I'll don't quote me on that. I'll Google it now just to make sure.
Okay.
But it was a young woman who went to the city I live in. There's a harbour, and between us and the harbour is in the caldera of a dead volcano.
Oh.
And so the rim of the volcano is a set of hills called the Port Hills that surrounds the port.
Okay.
And at 5:30 in the morning or something, she got up and inexplicably went driving up there and went missing, and they found her body 2 weeks later. Emma Campbell. Yeah. In 2010, Emma Campbell went missing in the Port Hills, and they found her body 2 weeks later.
Okay.
Which was weird, and that's why I knew so much at the time when I read that study, because when it played out, I was following it in real time as it happened at the time.
Okay.
Which is why it was so jarring when his reporting of it didn't match up with my experience of watching it myself when it happened.
So what did he say versus what you saw?
Well, his summary was like 2 paragraphs long.
Okay.
But, the passion that he was like, and it was near water. And it's like, well, yeah, it's water, but you don't think of that as being near water. Like the whole of New Zealand is near water. It's
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but a disqualifying factor for him is if anyone had any mental health issues.
I don't remember, honestly.
And that woman was quite well known for experiencing mental health issues at the time. Not, just she struggled with some depression and things, I believe, was what was reported at the time. Because I remember her family saying she struggled with depression, so we were a bit worried about her, that she'd suddenly go missing. And if before they even found her, the family was saying, this is why we're worried.
Okay.
It struck me as weird that he had just overlooked that when, and I could be wrong, but I had thought that he had made quite a big thing of saying I discard anyone that has a history of mental health issues.
Yeah, he might have. It's been so long since I've gone through his stuff. I don't remember. He had a number of things, and I think he started kind of sliding on some of them as he collected more cases, especially the ones with, that sounds like the sort of all the people dying in bodies of water thing, like the Smiley Face Killers book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of those probably had very prosaic explanations. But so what do you know what happened to this woman?
I don't believe we've ever really found out. They suspect, so those hills, and here's another thing. There's a kind of a township around the harbour, and then there's the main city. And it's really, 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 really common for people who live here to drive over those hills or to go hang out on those hills of an evening. Like it's a really, really well-trodden, like it's effectively a main road, and she was found like 200 meters from it.
Okay.
And the theory is that she was struggling with mental health. She couldn't sleep. She got up. She thought, I'm going to try and start the day on a positive foot, and went to watch the sunrise, went up to the hills, and then it's because it's a scenic and very twisty road. It's quite common for people to drive quite fast around there, to treat it as a driving road. So the theory is she went up to watch the sunrise, assumed that she was the only person up there, maybe was kind of a little bit close to the edge of the road, got hit by someone who also thought they were the only person up there who was going for a drive, and that they were trying to cover their tracks. But there were a lot of things that were, for instance, her wallet was found weirdly positioned on the passenger seat of her car with no money missing. Which you can see how that could appeal to David Paulides.
Yes.
But also, it would also be really consistent with someone who accidentally ran someone over and who was trying to hide the body and make it like it was an accident.
Yeah. That was actually, I think, one of the other cases that people were telling me, like they had left a wallet and stuff in the car, but it looked like foul play.
Yeah, so when I was just Googling it then, the last news report I could find was that they were looking for 2 or possibly 3 people of interest who were seen looking suspicious in the area, which would suggest that I think it's probably foul play, and that because it was an accident, stuff like establishing motive and things don't work so well.
Yeah. Someone wasn't someone wasn't trying to kill her. It was, Yeah,
it was just someone went for a drive and she went to the hills, and, that happened.
Yeah.
Which I think would be a very difficult thing to track down. In that situation, you'd be relying on somebody being so guilt-ridden that they fessed up. But
yeah. Or having left some kind of physical evidence.
Yeah. But I think, so the fact that it took a few weeks to find the body, I think probably if there was any trace evidence, it would have been...
Yeah, deteriorated.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely some weird cases in the missing 411 stuff, but I think probably 80 to 90% of them are prosaic explanations that we just don't have all the info for, or maybe weren't researched as well as they should have been, or followed up on,
So that's the thing, is it really, The majority of them are really, really interesting cases.
Yeah.
But once you start to find a couple that, like that was the case that when I read it, I was like, the reporting of it in this book is so not what my experience of it as a local was, that it makes me question all the other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean those cases aren't also uniquely interesting, but it did really cause me to think, I don't think there is a correlation here, because I can't tell case by case how much has been misreported on every single case here.
Yeah. Well, also, you being a local, you know things like, people drive on that hill all the time, which he may not know just looking at news reports.
Yeah. But and also, like, if you didn't look into it too much, you'd be like, well, it was on the hill overlooking a harbour. So you'd be like, oh, well, it ticks my close to water box.
Yeah.
But again, name a space in New Zealand that is not within however many kilometers to...
That's most of the world, honestly. There's water everywhere. Unless you're in the middle of a desert, there's probably a lake or an ocean near you. So, I mean, depending on how far you want to call near water, that's not really a good way of doing that.
Well, isn't it like 98.7% of the population of Australia is within like 15 kilometers of the coast, even though it's a huge country?
Yeah, because it's all desert in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got to take a break. We'll be right back. Quick mid-show break, contact info, and a recommendation. First of all, wheredidtheroadgo.com is the main place to go to find everything Where Did the Road Go related. Oof, hard words. And a huge kudos and thank you to John Tudor, who has completely renovated the site, and it looks amazing, and it's even better than it was before. So thank you, John. You're awesome. The man's a wizard with websites. Everything is there. Links to all our Facebook pages, all that type of stuff. You can listen to all the shows all the way back to the very first one in 2013. And a bunch of other stuff, including our store, our TeePublic store, where you can get designs by Tim Renner and the late Jeff Ritzman for Where Did the Road Go. There's also a Discord, which is now built into the website. So that's kind of cool. If you want to become a patron, it's only $3 a month. You get the shows a week early. You get them ad-free, as well as extra content pretty much every week, and it's only $3. So, it helps us out a lot, and we really appreciate the support. You can also support us by rating us on whatever you're listening to, leaving us good reviews, things like that, spreading the word. It's all appreciated. If you like heavy music, I also host a music show called The Last Exit for the Lost. You can find that at thelastexit.org. There's a large archive of shows there, and there's a new show every single week. As for recommendations, I mentioned this book during this show somewhere. I don't know if it was in the main show or the Patreon segment. Michael Marshall Smith's The Servants, which I just felt like I was supposed to read, and I read it. And and then it kind of gelled in with some of the stuff that was going on in this conversation, because it kind of starts like a ghost story, and that's not really what it is. I kind of figured that it was going to twist, because Michael Marshall Smith does that. It is not by any means my favorite book from him, but it's a lighter story from him. A lot of his stuff is really, really dark. This one's not. I mean, it has its moments, but it's more, if anything, it falls more in the fantasy category. There's not really any horror in it. I mean, bordering on thriller maybe, but it's a good story, and I enjoyed it. So I don't want to give anything away because it does have some interesting twists. The Servants. That's my recommendation for this week. Now back to the show. I am here with Chris G from New Zealand, and you had one more weird experience. And you said this is in a quarantine area.
Yeah.
So can you explain what that is?
Today than it did at the time, but so my dad, I mentioned earlier, my dad moved overseas when I was quite young. Yeah. And one of the places he spent a lot of time was in Sydney, which is on the near edge of Australia. So I used to spend quite a lot of time there as I was growing up. And one of the places we went when I was there one time, there is a quarantine station on the northern head of Sydney Harbour in an area called Manly.
And what is a quarantine station?
So it was back when they were settling Australia, they would, obviously the immigrants and the settlers would come across on boats.
Yeah.
And back then, if anyone got sick on the boat with anything serious, rather than let them loose on the mainland, they would dump them in a quarantine station, which was an isolated place, just like the COVID quarantine in here.
Right.
Or anywhere. You'd isolate from everyone, but everyone who was on that boat would isolate with everyone else who had been on any boat where someone had been sick. So if someone came down with pox or something on your boat, you'd dump the entire contents of the boat on this quarantine station.
Gotcha.
And most of the time you'd die there because,
because you were exposed to something. Yeah.
Yeah. Or because you weren't exposed to something, but when they dumped you in this one station where everybody was, it would spread through the station.
Oh man.
It's pretty rough. And the place, it's fascinating, and it's in a national park, and it's still treated as such. But when I first went, we actually knew one of the park rangers who policed the place, who lived there and looked after it. And we accepted their offer to go and just explore the place. It wasn't actually open to the public. It's just we knew someone who knew the park ranger kind of deal. And I was, again, a young teenager, and I was desperate to show off. And I was pretty gung-ho about it all. And the place does feel super creepy. Like it doesn't feel right.
Right.
But I was pretty determined to demonstrate how unaffected by that vibe I was. And so the process was they'd unload you on the pier and they'd autoclave all of your luggage, which meant they'd have these huge steam pressure ovens, and they'd just cook all of your possessions at a couple of 100 degrees and several atmospheres of pressure. And while that was happening, they would gas you in a gas chamber. And the idea was that would kill anything in your lungs. This is, like I said, back when I was settling Australia, medical science has come a wee way since.
Yeah.
But then you'd leave the gas chamber and go into a shower block, which is a truly horrifying place. So it's a large room where you walk in some double doors up the front, and there'd be a large aisle up the middle. So you go in those front doors and up an aisle, and off either side, there'd be a 3-stage set of cubicles. So the first cubicle you would undress in, and when I say cubicle, it was sort of shin height to about just below shoulder height of corrugated iron. And you'd undress there. You would step into the middle cubicle, which was a shower where they would shower you with carbolic acid.
Oh.
And the purpose of the carbolic acid was to kill anything on your skin.
Right.
But it also had the unfortunate side effect of stripping the outer layer of skin off.
Right. Ugh.
You would then step into the third cubicle, where waiting for you was sort of a concentration camp style uniform that you'd put on, and then they'd take your clothes and burn them.
Wow.
Then you would file down. So then you would now step out of that third cubicle, and you'd be on one of the two sides of the building, where you would continue in the same direction you entered, but there'd be an aisle down each side, and you'd go down there and exit out the other end of the building. And when you came out that other end of the building, you were deemed clean. And you'd be shown to your quarters, which were either first, second, third, or Oriental class. And you'd stay there until you probably died, at which points you'd be dissected so they could understand how you died.
I can give them some guesses.
Yeah. Well, but I think as well, part of the thought was we can get some insight into we know how they've died, but we want to know more. Like if they've already died, let's learn a bit about the disease.
Yeah.
But it's a really unpleasant place. You can feel the whole place is just heavy with atmosphere even today. And when we first went, like I said, it wasn't open to the public, and we were just wandering around with torches and things. And the park ranger had a lot of really interesting stories, and I can circle back to some of them. But the thing they said is the shower block is just not right. Like there's something really wrong with that room. And me being me, at the time I volunteered, I was like, yeah, I'll go in there. Tell you what, I'll go in and take a look around, and you guys can all stay here, and I'll come out and tell you how wonderful I am. So I went in, and they closed the door behind me. I think the park ranger was pretty keen to knock me down a couple of pegs, but I went in, and it's really hard to express how not right it feels in there, Seriah. Like, it really doesn't feel right. And I went in, and I walked up the middle of it, and it was really disconcerting in there. It's not a nice place.
Yeah. Did it feel like oppressive, like something didn't want you there, or?
No, and that's the weird thing, is I had felt scared in places before, and it always had that sort of oppressive, like, ooh, this feels spooky kind of thing.
Yeah.
This just, it just felt off. Like it felt like the normal rules of reality just didn't apply. It felt like I just didn't know the rules of the game. And I walked up the middle a bit, and it felt spooky, but it didn't, like, it just felt spooky. But then really, really clearly, there was something. So imagine you've walked through the front door of this building. You're walking down the aisle in the middle. There's the sort of 3 cubicles set up to the left and the 3 cubicles set up to the right. And then beyond that is another aisle, like a really thin aisle on each side, that goes all the way to the end of the other building, the other end of the same building. And I was probably about a third of the way up that central aisle, and I distinctly felt, like, really clearly, that there was something behind me and to the left, sort of over in that far aisle off to my left. And it wasn't like, that felt spooky. What was that? Was that a thing sound? It was really clearly, like, totally unambiguously, there was something there. And also totally unambiguously, it was not human. And I could feel it moving, like it was flanking me to the left. Like, it didn't feel, there was no, it's really hard to express this. It wasn't I'm hearing some sounds over there, or I thought I heard something, or I'm scared by how dark it is over there. It was really clearly, there was something over there, and it wasn't moving like a person moves, and it's flanking me and it's hunting me. So it starts moving from over my left shoulder, sort of back in the back left corner behind me, starts kind of moving down the left-hand side. So I turn to face it, and how do I express this? It felt like it... You know the Aliens films?
Yeah.
How the xenomorphs, like, come at you along walls and over ceilings and stuff?
Right.
It was just like that. It's like, whatever this thing is, it's on the ceiling, and it's coming for me across the ceiling. And that was the result of hearing things and sort of seeing vague movement, and like, there were a whole bunch of things that fed into the sensation.
Right.
And I'm like, there is something really clearly, like, and I could already tell it was not human, but if there was any doubt, the fact it's coming across the ceiling at me means it's totally not human, whatever this thing is. Right as I'm struggling with that concept, I became aware that, just almost like someone had flicked a light and something had, like, spawned into a computer game. I'm like, there's something off to the right, like at the end of that main aisle. And I had this moment of, this real kind of rabbit in the headlights moment of, do I turn to that to try and figure out what that is that could be just not real?
Right.
Or do I stay focused on the alarming sense that something very, very real is coming across the ceiling at me? And right as I had that kind of moment, have you ever had that sense of being right on the edge of blacking out?
Yes.
And everything sort of
tunnel vision
slows down. Yep. Like your vision narrows down, and sound.
Yeah.
Sound. Strange. Like it sounded like that. Like I had that really distinct, I'm blacking out sense. But what happened is, along with that strange sense of blacking out, I could almost, like someone had their fingers on a whole bunch of faders for, like, ambient sounds of that room from the past. Almost like someone had just kind of pushed all those sliders up. And I could just start hearing, and it was really distorted because it all sounded really slow and weird. But I could hear showers and steam and corrugated iron doors opening and closing, and shuffling and talking. And the next thing I knew, like in the middle of all of that, I just had the sense that someone was talking to me, and I became aware that the park ranger was shining a torch in my face.
Oh,
and was asking me if I was okay. And I was like, what? And the others laughed, and I heard laughter, and I'm like, I'm being laughed at. But what I didn't understand is what had happened between those two moments.
Right.
And apparently what had happened is I had flown out that front door that I'd gone in and closed behind me, like I was Asterix running on air in the, Asterix comic books. Like I just flown out the front door, and I'd been completely non-responsive for, I don't know, like 8 or 10 seconds. Wow. And everyone's like, what is wrong with him? And then I kind of came around and snapped out of it. That experience was not something spooked me, because I have been spooked by stuff dozens of times over my life.
Right.
And it doesn't play out like that. There was a realness and a tangibility to it all that just... It was an experience that's not like any other experience I've ever had.
And it's not an experience I've ever heard anyone describe before.
So this is what's weird, because obviously I'm like, a few weeks later, I was like, this place is awesome, I want to go back. Like with a bit of distance from it, all of a sudden it's really appealing.
Right.
So over the years since, and it's been a couple of decades now, I have been back a number of times. I must have been back, 11 or 12 times over the years. And for years and years and years, I'd experienced things, there were definite vibes, but I never experienced anything like that. And I would hear stories, and I would see people experience things around me, or report they'd sort of seen things or heard things or whatever. Like one of the times that was really crazy, a few years after that, they actually commercialized it, and you can actually go there now as tours. Like you can pay money and a tour guide will show you around. Which has totally ruined it, because they try to sell it as ghost tours. And so you get these overly hammed up people who are determined to deliver you an experience, quote unquote.
Right.
And they'll do stuff like, you'll be in the morgue and they'll literally kick a metal bucket to scare you and things. But and it's weird, because it's like some sort of weird, it's like psychic weather. You go sometimes and it's all clear and you can't feel it. And other times you go and you're like, ooh, it's going to be a good night. And sure enough, someone at some time totally loses it and then swears black and blue they experienced something, or they felt something, or they saw something, or whatever. But you can feel when you get there, you're like, oh, it's, not much is going to happen tonight, or it's going to be a good one.
Yeah.
And it'll even be location by location. You walk around and you'll be like, I've had times where I was like, yeah, it's going to be a quiet night. And then you go, and I've got to say, I'm not a paranormal believer kind of guy. It's just, there's something really not right with this place. And I think that's the compulsion, is I'm like, this doesn't fit my worldview. And so you kind of compulsively go back, and people around you are experiencing these things. And you're like, yeah, I don't really know what to do about that. But there was one time, for instance, I was with a group and we were being led around. And as we came up to, there was like one building, that was where the second class passengers, it was like their dining room, and they'd all go there to have their meal in the evening and stuff. And as we approached it, the kitchen is below it, because it's on a hillside, and it's on the hillside where they used to bury all the dead bodies.
Oh.
And the kitchen underneath it is kind of wedged into the hillside underneath the main dining room. As we approached, the lights were on, and you could hear people talking, and you could hear the clanging and the banging of the pots and yada, yada, yada. And the tour guide was like, I'm so sorry. This is really ruining the vibe. Clearly, because during the daytime and stuff, they'll host venues there. And they're like, clearly we've got some venue booking, and the caterers are cleaning up afterwards. Sorry, this is really ruining the vibe for you guys. We were like, no worries. So we went into the dining room, we went down the stairs, we got down to the kitchen, the lights were off, there was not a person in there, the oven was cold.
Kind of figured, yeah.
And we then all stood there for like 8 minutes while the tour guide walked around and around and around, desperately trying to find the people, the caterers we'd all clearly heard cleaning up afterwards. And they were on the walkie, and the walkie was saying, no, there's no one there. But yeah, it's, there's been a couple of things like that over the years, not every time, but the one that really threw me though is, 15 years after that experience I had in the shower block, there was one tour guide who was telling me, so it's on what used to be Aboriginal land. Okay. And the Aborigines considered it to be a sacred place. Sort of like, what the Irish would call a thin place.
Okay.
And they had he was telling me about how the Aborigines had this legend, and obviously the First Nations of Australia, that they were quite segmented, and they each, depending all around the country, they had different legends and they had different myths and different stories. But apparently the Indigenous population of that area had the tale of, and I wish I could remember the name of it now, but they had the name, this particular trickster spirit, sort of think Loki from the Marvel Universe, but it was a large quadrupedal sort of bento. It's sort of like a gigantic sloth, but it could move very quickly, and it was sort of 5 or 6 times the size of a person, and it thrived off distressing people and sucking their psychic energy. And its party piece, its hallmark, was coming at you across like the ceiling of caves, or coming at you. And he was saying they believed that when they built this place, it still lived here, and it would come at you across the ceilings, especially in the shower block. Now, this is a guy I've never spoken to in my life. I haven't told him the story. He's never heard anyone else come up with a story like mine.
Right.
And he's just going, I looked into it a bit, and apparently there's this legend of the Aborigines believed they would warn that, you got to watch out for this trickster god, this trickster being, who will come at you across the ceiling, and it particularly likes the shower block because that's where people are experiencing the most. And it really jumped out at me.
Well, yeah, just a bit.
Because I'm like, this guy's telling me what I experienced like 15 years previously. And I'm not thinking that, like, that's not a story that fits neatly with any legend I've ever heard. It's not like, he's telling that old story of,
Right.
Like what impressed me about it at the time, what impressed in the sense of what made it stick in my mind so much, was that it wasn't like you experience something like that and you're like, my nerves must have got the better with me, and I'm just conjuring my brain's applying the pattern of some movie I've seen that scared me, or some story I've heard that scared me.
Right.
And it's like pattern matching and going, this is that scary thing. It's happening to you now. It was very much unlike anything I'd ever heard.
Right.
It's not like my brain's just going, this is the plot of that movie.
Yeah.
You're in it. It's happening to you now. I could not have come up with that story if I tried. And then this guy's telling me 15 years later, just, throwaway comment. So the Indigenous population used to warn people that if you're not careful, this will happen to you, and then describes what I had experienced.
That must have been surreal.
Yeah. So I'm like, excuse me. And then I told him the story.
And if it is a sacred spot, and then you had all that bad energy there, that just doubles up stuff happening there.
Well, because I think back on it, so like talking to you now, I'm thinking, I prefaced the story with like, I wanted to show everybody what a big swinging dick I was. So I'm like, I'll go in there. There's nothing to be scared of. And if I think back, every time I saw anyone have a bad experience, it was always the person who was taking the piss. Like they were always the one who's like, it's all garbage, it's this, it's that.
Right,
and they were being disrespectful to the environment. And they're always the person who had the bad experience.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, we are out of time, but let's continue talking about this on a Patreon segment.
Sounds good.
All right, I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons for their support. Without you, this show would not be possible. And I want to give a shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Marthartha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Andrew Malone, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Illuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, land of the crazy and communicable, CJ, Corey Nelson, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jamin Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, John Hewling, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Matthew Brown, Sasha McHale, No One, Oli Andre Olar, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Roland Belstadt, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sarah Horgan, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Stacy Sherwood, Stevie Norman, Strange Stories with the Seeker and Skeptic podcast, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, the Esoteric Book Club podcast, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Varosh K, Victoria, Vincent Trewell, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Colin Karras, and Craig Sagastumi. Thank you all so very much for the support. If you enjoyed that conversation, we keep going for quite a bit in a Patreon segment. If you want to become a patron, it's only $3 a month. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the big Patreon link and join up. And you also get archives that are downloadable of entire years of either Patreon content or show content and some other special stuff hidden. Amongst all of that, there's some video stuff, and you can watch the documentary Chris Ernst did about Where Did the Road Go as well there. Hopefully that will eventually be up on Amazon. But right now, that is the main place you can get it, is through the Patreon. I want to welcome a new Patreon, that being Tori Oot. I want to thank No One for jumping up to sponsor level. Thank you so much. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.